Wherever you are watching from around the globe, whether it be live now or recorded, welcome Formula One fans to Fans Forum, the show where we put you guys in pole position, driving the conversation. And once again, it's been a bumper weekend, hasn't it? A bit topsy-turvy, almost like two separate events, but the Chinese Grand Prix weekend has very much delivered, and we will be getting into every single element with it once again with our VIP guest. But of course, we're nothing without you guys. We want your full engagement in the comments and chat box so we know how you feel about the weekend, right? How you feel about the start of the Grand Prix, the F1 season. Really looking forward to you guys engaging in the show, so make sure that you do. And of course, a bumper weekend means that we saw a certain Lewis Hamilton securing his and Ferrari's first sprint wins. But then on the other side of that, let's not discuss it, but let's stay positive in a sense that McLaren secured the 50th 1-2 of their Formula One history. But it was Oscar Piastri rather than Lando Norris taking the checkered flag. But listen, that's enough from me. Let's get into introducing our VIP guest for today's show. It's none other than Callum from Grid Talk Global. Callum, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I'm really good. How are you?
Big weekend, mate, wasn't it? And
Yes,
did you
definitely.
enjoy it? Did you get up hardcore to watch it live, or are you a bit more of a pre-record man?
No, I woke up for every single qualifying race thing. I'm very hardcore like that. I always want to watch it live. Hate waking up on my phone and seeing all the results there. So I'm very much a live person.
Good man, absolutely loving that. I will confess that I did watch sprint qualifying live, but then after that, I put a video out, a short, just recapping that Lewis was on pole for Ferrari, and it was like, hey, everyone, Lewis is on pole. Yay, Lewis, I'm going to bed. It kind of put my whole weekend behind, but I caught up with everything else pretty quick. And it was, as I said, it was just brilliant. It was an absolute roller coaster from the sprint event through to the Grand Prix itself. And myself and Callum are going to be getting into all of it as we have our first engagement from the box. And a very hello to a regular Gary Thompson in there. Thanks for joining us, Gary, once again. But Callum, listen, before we get into the event that was the Chinese Grand Prix weekend, first and foremost, tell us a little bit about how your love affair for F1 began.
So my love affair for F1 began quite a number of years ago, actually. It was 2011 when my dad was watching it on the TV, and it was the Japanese Grand Prix in which Sebastian Vettel won his second championship. So my sort of spark for F1, my love for F1 began then. I wouldn't say I was fully into F1. I was sort of keeping up with it a little bit here and there. I caught up more again when Sebastian Vettel moved to Ferrari in 2015. I know that was like a big move from going from Red Bull to Ferrari. So I sort of caught up more again. But I would say I've been a big F1 fan more since about 2018. But, it sparked ever since about 2011 when I was about 10. So quite a long time now.
You've been making some great content recently on the Grid Talk Global handle, but I see you in every team's colours. Where does your affiliation lie, my man?
What was that, sorry?
Where does your affiliation lie on the grid? I see you in regular different colours, whether it be Ferrari, Williams, which I see you're sporting this evening, even Racing Bulls. You are a committed man, but where does your heart lie?
My heart lies with Ferrari and Williams as my favourite two teams. So after this weekend, it's been very split emotions for me, as you can quite imagine.
Yeah, too true. So Williams both finishing in the points, but at the expense of the whole Ferrari situation. Now, usually, Callum, I would go into this conversation in the order of how they finished, right? But I want to ask you, when do you want to get into the Ferrari situation? Do you want to go first? Do you want to hold it back till last because they didn't actually classify in the end? Or do you want to plunk it in somewhere else?
Let's start with it. Let's start with Ferrari Fiasco.
Is it the biggest story of the weekend, really? Do we have to say that, even over the dominance of the McLarens in the 1-2 in the Grand Prix? Is it the fact that Ferrari got to such a high point with Lewis Hamilton on pole and the win, and then didn't even have two cars that were classified? Is that the biggest story for you for the weekend?
It's definitely up there as the biggest stories. I mean, the last time both teammates from one team got disqualified is I can't actually remember how
Yeah,
long ago, but I think the last time I remember double DSQ was actually Charles and Lewis back at Cota in 2023. So it's quite
right.
interesting that this exact same pairing has been disqualified once again. But it's definitely up there as one of the biggest stories. I would say alongside the whole Liam Lawson situation that's going on, I would say those two are definitely the biggest stories coming out of the Chinese Grand Prix.
So Rihanna Jordan, who was actually our guest on last week, she's got big Lewis love in her heart. I know that. And she's saying, yep, you know
Yeah,
what? Get the pain out of the way. But you know
definitely.
what, Rihanna, as well, they do say that it only hurts so much because the love was so pure, right? So, you know, if that love from the Saturday hadn't happened and the performance in the sprint race, then maybe it wouldn't hurt so hard on the Sunday. So looking at it, Callum, what do you think is going through Lewis Hamilton's head at the moment? Because this is the organisation that he's joined. He's looking for that 8th title. Do you think he's thinking, "Oh, you know, maybe I've bitten off a bit more than I can chew here," or do you think he was expectant that this was going to take time, particularly when we're looking at the strategic element of the team?
I think he must have thought it was going to take a little bit of time. You know, Ferrari's been known as sort of the clown of strategies over the years, and that's that was showcased again last weekend at the Australian Grand Prix, which Lewis unfortunately firsthand saw.
Mm,
But it's hard to say with Lewis. You know, with some Mercedes supposedly doing really well now, he must be thinking, was it the right time to move over? You know, some of those thoughts must be going through his head, but at the end of the day, the new regulations are coming up. Maybe he saw something that others didn't. You know, Lewis is definitely one of the most experienced drivers on the grid. He's probably, arguably the best driver on the grid. So, you know, it was his decision at the end of the day, and he's going to stick with it and be happy with it, no matter really what happens. I think.
yeah, Max might have something to say about that opinion that you just threw out there, and Max fans, of course. But so
One
Gary
of the
said,
best drivers.
yeah, Gary has said, how did they get the setup so wrong from the sprint? What would be your opinions on that? If you've dominated a race so much, and I guess for some people watching out there, they must be thinking, how can you do so well in like the mini version and then it fall apart so much in the Grand Prix? What's your perspective on that? And then maybe what have you heard across the socials, etc., since?
It was quite interesting because I saw an interview that Lewis did after the race, and he was talking about some of the changes that they made, and he was a bit confused about them, and he didn't really understand why necessarily the changes were made in sort of a different context.
Mm,
It's interesting because you would think, it's pretty much you go with the same setup. It's no different conditions really. The weather hasn't really changed. Obviously there could be a bit more tire degradation. There was a lot seen throughout the sprint race itself. We saw that with Max. We saw his tires degrade pretty fast. So maybe
and
they were
Lando, of
thinking,
course. Yeah, that's why
yes,
Lando was way down in P8.
but we probably saw they probably expected that to happen, maybe change their, output or change their car based on the data they got, at least through the tire side of things. But, they had a decent start ish. I mean, obviously they collided at the start, which is unfortunate, a bit of a racing incident, but they were ahead of the Max throughout most of the race, and then suddenly out of nowhere, their tires went and Max overtook them both. So they clearly just got the setup all wrong this weekend.
Really good point from Gary, though, and I love how
Yeah,
much he gets into it. It's like fuel load is a big point. You know, that high
yeah,
fuel load, tire wear is completely different. But it also feels that when we're hearing interactions on the radio, the maybe the driver isn't quite in harmony with the team. And Charles Leclerc, that they when they were talking about the strategy during the Grand Prix, seemed he had a difference in opinion, and the engineer was feeding back saying, well, no, we think you'll hit too much traffic if you do that. I know hindsight is a beautiful thing, but when things like that come out publicly, they're always going to be in a difficult position as a race team, aren't they?
yeah, definitely. It's happened for many seasons, unfortunately, for Charles Leclerc. He says one thing, his engineer says another, and then they collide, and it always happens, after the race that, oh, Leclerc is right, Ferrari strategies are wrong, or vice versa. It always seems to be a never-ending battle, unfortunately, between Leclerc, even Lewis now, and the Ferrari team.
Yeah, and I also saw during the week that there were thoughts that perhaps the Ferrari simulations weren't quite correct, and the feedback that they were giving to the team about what's the right call to make. And I guess if it's been 2 race weekends to a certain extent in a row, they're going to have to go back and look at that. And whether even if they don't admit to that publicly, we saw, didn't we, with Mercedes for almost like a year, and then eventually they came out and said, yeah, okay, like the calibration back at HQ is wrong. Do you expect something like that from Ferrari?
I think it's definitely happening. Whether they actually admit it or not, maybe it's an end of the season thing they admit. We don't know. I don't know if Ferrari themselves, such a big brand, will publicly come out and said we got it totally wrong. But I definitely think something's gone on behind the scenes with the whole setup, the simulation stuff. They definitely should be faster. Definitely should be higher up the grid, both drivers' championships, constructors' championships, than what they are right now. They're joint on points with Williams at the moment with 17. They're both drivers are below Lance Stroll in the Drivers' Championship, who's, let's be honest, no one expects much from Lance Stroll. So he's done all right this year so far, but you would expect Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton in the Ferrari to be much higher than where they are.
But expectation can be a very big weight. So
Definitely.
Maybe that is playing into Lance's favour there. Another one from Gary as well, just saying that Leclerc's front left tyre not degrading as much due to the front wing damage that he had, that collision between the two drivers. And correct me if I'm wrong, Callum, Charles actually came out and said it wasn't really anyone's fault. It was a racing incident. He didn't want to blame Lewis for that, and he was quite clear, correct?
Yeah, he came out and said it was a racing incident. He said that Lewis definitely wouldn't have seen him there, and then obviously that caused a collision. But he said basically came out instantly and said it was a racing incident. Obviously trying to make sure that there's no public headlines saying that Hamilton and Leclerc are fighting already and all of that fiasco stuff that we always hear after the Grand Prix. So I think it was a smart move from Leclerc to come out and say that at least very quickly as well.
So let's move it on to the positives from the race weekend, or particularly from a papaya perspective, securing the win in the Grand Prix with Oscar Piastri, which may be slightly surprising for some fans out there, because it feels a bit, and maybe that we're being British centric here, but it feels like Lando is very much the poster boy for the team. But Oscar Piastri securing the win from pole position as well, his first pole position. What did you make of Oscar's performance across the weekend? Because even watching the broadcast, we didn't really see much of him during the Grand Prix, did we? He just really went about his business.
Yeah, he was superb pretty much all weekend. Even in the sprint, maybe he could have qualified a bit better, but still qualified ahead of Lando, who had a bit of a rough sprint race, as everyone saw. But he, got a qualified P3. He got a P2 in the end, which was probably the best result, considering how well Hamilton drove. And then the race was just superb. He's got his first pole position. A lot of people last year questioned his qualifying against Lando Norris. Lando Norris was, I think, 20-4 in qualifying last year. But this year so far, Oscar Piastri has been pretty much where Lando is. They both got a pole. They both got a second in qualifying. But if you look at the sprint race, Oscar Piastri technically is ahead of qualifying sessions right now over Lando Norris. So maybe those questions have been answered. Obviously, it's only been 2 races of the season, so it's hard to really say until we get maybe to around the summer break sort of area. But it was superb. He led 53 laps out of the 56. It was just, flawless from Oscar Piastri. You couldn't, especially after what happened last weekend, that could have, knocked his confidence a bit, especially it was his home race, but it seemed to affect him, at all. When I sort of think if that happened to Lando Norris last weekend, I think that may have affected him more than what it did to Piastri.
Yeah, what do you think about the mentality of Piastri? Rihanna Jordan, who was just commenting a little earlier, I guess last week, she was saying that Oscar has a real ruthlessness, perhaps, to his race that Lando needs to work on. Would you agree?
I would agree. I would definitely agree with that. I think Oscar Piastri definitely reminds me of Kimi. Not Anthony Raikkonen for everyone. He definitely reminds me of that sort of person, a bit more
cool and calculated.
Cool, calculated. I feel like he's definitely gets his elbows out more. Look at last weekend when he overtook Hamilton on the last lap. That was a fantastic overtake that I don't think Lando would have gone for. I just think he's more cool, calm, collected than Lando. That's not me saying he's definitely a better racer than Lando. I think they're very equal in that terms, but in terms of mentality, I think Oscar has it over Lando, at least currently.
And then we heard as well that Oscar Piastri's Chinese heritage is also part of helping him over the line. Did you see that little clip? I think it's
Yeah, him
1/16
and
Chinese
George
he's claiming
Russell.
to be. So somewhat of a home race for Oscar Piastri. And I'm sure the Chinese people love that, don't you think?
Definitely. I mean, it seems like after every weekend he's some sort of, he's a part of Monaco, he's a part of China, he's obviously Australian. Seems like
Yeah.
every weekend it's something from Oscar Piastri, which I do think adds to his, humour, his funny side every time.
Yeah, I guess that it's that part of the world that unless you are an Aborigine, then you are from everywhere else, aren't you?
Yeah.
On the other side of the garage for Papaya, Lando Norris, okay, secured the P2. But the thing that stood out for me about Lando was the qualifying performance, both in the Grand Prix and also in the sprint.
Yeah.
He went in on his second flying lap in SQ3 and Q3. So I guess we go in there a little bit about this idea of mentality and consistency. What did you make of that?
It was a strange one with Lando because he was absolutely flying in qualifying 1, qualifying 2, SQ1, SQ2. He seemed really comfortable, but as soon as he got to those SQ3s, or Q3s, he sort of made the errors that everyone pointed to last year with Lando.
Mm.
It must come back to mentality, locking up at the last corner when realistically he was like I think about 2/10 ahead of Hamilton at that point in time. I think it's just mentality barriers again with Lando. I don't doubt his abilities as a driver. We've seen it time and time again, even when the car wasn't good. When Ricardo was struggling with the car, he was absolutely fantastic at times, getting on podiums when he really shouldn't have been. So I don't doubt the fact that he has the driving ability. I just think now when they've got the fastest car, he can't overcome the fact that they've got the fastest car now. He's always been, didn't have much expectations or much pressure behind him to deliver. Those are all over deliveries, over expectations of him. But now with the fastest car, everyone expects him to win the championship. Everyone predicted Lando coming this season become the 2025 championship champion, myself included. And I think that's a big pressure to have on Lando, and I think that's we could see it over the course of the season that affect him more and more.
So what do you think though in with regards to his development? Can he overcome this? Because if we look at him, he's overcome Lando no wins. He's overcome the midway point of last season. He'd lost positions from X amount of starts. And if we look at the start for the Grand Prix this weekend, it was blistering
it was brilliant
past George Russell. So he's showing us that he can develop and evolve as a driver. And we always forget these are still very young men, aren't they?
They are very young. It's crazy to think that they're all so young. A lot of the grid are still young. But, he's proven, apart from the sprint race, where obviously he dropped due to a bit of an error on lap 1, throughout the whole Australian Grand Prix, every safety car, every restart, he was ahead. And then during, obviously, the actual race in China, he got ahead of George Russell on the opening lap. So he is improving. He is getting better. But when you're being compared to your teammate directly in both the fastest car and everyone's saying, oh, Oscar's better than you, Oscar's better mentality than you, that's going to eventually, keep weighing down on him. It's whether that he can overcome that sort of mentality. I don't doubt his abilities at all. I think he's going to keep improving. I think he is going to be a world champion one day. But it's whether he can beat the expectation of beating drivers like Max Verstappen, beating drivers like Oscar Piastri, who's coming out of nowhere as a sensational rookie. It's whether he can overcome that sort of mentality that I don't doubt his driving abilities at all.
Yeah, it's the idea of blocking out the noise, which even ourselves being here, we are a part of it, right? But we love it, so we want to discuss it. Just that part about Piastri and being this amazing rookie. Let me ask you, has he set a problem for the rest of the grid in F1 with regards to what their expectations are now of new drivers? Because I do feel like you said, he's almost this benchmark that they all want someone who's going to come in now and just blow it out of the water, and they're not being given time. We're going to get onto some of them a little bit later, but has Piastri caused a problem for F1 rookies?
I think so. Maybe not for the lesser teams, but for teams like Mercedes, obviously bringing in Kimi Antonelli, obviously teams like Red Bull bringing in Leah Lawson. I think Oscar Piastri has set an extremely high expectation of what rookies should be able to at least perform to or get near to in F1. So I think with how good he was in his first year, I'm thinking people like Toto Wolff, Christian Horner expecting the likes of Kimi Antonelli, Liam Lawson to do those sort of things as well, which I don't know if is achievable.
Well, let's move our attention to the Silver Arrows Mercedes, who have got a rookie who is performing in the shape of Kimi Antonelli. But before we talk about him, Callum, I want to talk about the gen. I think he's almost the star of the season so far, because people have talked about Antonelli filling the shoes of Lewis Hamilton. But for me, it's George Russell filling the shoes of Hamilton, ready to lead that team. What have you made of George with back-to-back Grand Prix podiums and then a P4 in the sprint so far this season?
He's, for me, been the best driver of this year so far. Obviously, we know McLaren's got the fastest car, but for me, George Russell has been the star of the show. We don't really see much of him during the race, but that's a good thing in my eyes. It means you're doing a consistently good race. You know, he's out-qualified the likes of Lando in certain qualifying sessions. You know, he's going wheel to wheel. Some of these drivers, you know, he held off Lando, who's in the fastest car for 3 laps. But it's his consistency. And I think if he can stay consistent enough, he's in a shout for drivers' champion this year, definitely. Especially if Mercedes can keep up this sort of development.
Yeah, Gary making the point that just getting on with business. There's no pressure on him. And we've discussed earlier with a couple of the other drivers, pressure is the weight that some people are crumbling under. If we look at George's journey, in fact, I remember he started alongside Lewis, performing really well. And then was it the 2023 season? He fell away and he said he had to really go back and reanalyze where he was at because he got into his own head. And again, it's that idea of blocking out the noise, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. I think George has overcome that mentality issue. You know, a lot of expectations were put on him to be the lead Mercedes into this new era, to be the number 1 driver at Mercedes. And so far this season, he's doing that fantastically, I believe.
And what do you make of the machinery that he now has at his disposal?
It seems a lot more stable. That's definitely you know, certain. I think the car looks more stable. It looks a lot quicker. You know, you could say they might have the second fastest car on the grid. I think it's going to be track to track. But so far, they look a lot more stable. They look quick. They look fast. You know, both Kimi Antonelli and George Russell are both in the top 5 of the Drivers' Championships. They're currently second in the Constructors, which I don't think anyone was expecting going into the season. And so far, they're the biggest threat to McLaren, with, you know, Red Bull and Ferrari not doing so great.
We'll have to get Gary on as a third host, I think. He's involved in every conversation, which we appreciate, Gary. But just saying, yep, car set up right, then both drivers could be contenders. For you, Callum, contenders for what? Contenders just for race wins? Contenders, could they be up there? Or if you have both consistent, could it be contenders for the constructors? What do you think, Callum?
We saw last season that McLaren didn't start the season great. You know, they weren't anywhere. They were sort of P10s, P8s. They weren't really anywhere. And suddenly, out of nowhere, great development, and they won the constructors. If Mercedes can get upgrades right, development right, which is the most crucial thing going throughout the season, you know, there's definitely a shout for constructors. And I think with George's side, potentially drivers' championships, it's a little too early to call, but I think they could be in the shout definitely for race wins this season. You know, I'm expecting George. And I was predicted at the start of the season, I think Kimi Antonelli will get his first win in this rookie season.
So talk to me about the young man then, Kimi Antonelli, who was named driver of the day, and even Toto Wolff made the joke that I think it's more about your demographic and your appeal to the young market, who are very much engaged in the voting. But what did you make of him across the weekend? A sprint finish of P7, Grand Prix finish of P6. So solid points again as the highest performing rookie of the season so far, Kimi Antonelli.
He's been exceptional. I think he's sort of blew expectation out of the water. I remember everyone after the qualifying performance in Australia was, you know, sort of skeptical of him, but he's drove brilliantly both in, you know, Chinese Grand Prix, Australian Grand Prix. He's been super consistent. He's been picking up the points as what the second driver or the other driver of a team should be able to do, and he's been exceptional with her. Like I said, P5 in the driver's standings as an 18-year-old is phenomenal work. You know, we're talking about setting the boundaries as Oscar Piastri, but Kimi Antonelli could potentially beat him in his rookie season.
Wow. What, George Russell?
No,
was that
Kimi I think will beat Oscar Piastri's points in total for a rookie
okay, right,
season, I believe.
yeah. Sorry, I was kind of half typing to engage with Gary in the
That's
chat
all
box
right.
there, and then I picked up the end, and I was like, "Hang on, what to beat George?" But
No,
no,
I
yeah,
don't think it'll be George, but I think he'll be close. I do genuinely believe that he'll be close. And I made sort of a crazy prediction, sort of real at the start of the season, before the start of the season. I said Kimi Antonelli and George Russell will come away with equal amount of wins this year. Whether that's still going to happen, I don't know. I think George will pick up more wins, be the more consistent driver, but I don't think Kimi Antonelli will be too far behind. And people need to remember he's 18. He's got so many years to grow, so much time to reach his full potential.
Yeah, I've just put it in the chat box, and this is what I wanted to get the engagement on. Kimi Antonelli, potential world champion for the future, in your opinion, Callum?
Yes, I definitely think so. I think, with drivers like, Lewis not having much longer, we unsure about how much longer Max has. These new drivers are coming up and they're being phenomenal. I think Hajar's been pretty solid so far. His qualifying performances have been really good. I think Bortoletto so far has done a decent job with the Sauber car. And, I was watching him in F2 and, some of the moves he was making were simply phenomenal for someone his age. And yeah, I definitely believe he could be a future drivers champion. But we say this for every new driver that comes in. We said this for Leclerc, who may still get it, but is yet to get it. We said it for Lando at the start. He's still yet to get it. So I think let's not set the expectations so high on him so far, because we've seen that pressure get to people. But I think there's definitely potential there for a future drivers championship.
Yeah, we love a bit of hype, don't we? Parquet 713 saying, I think he has it in him. Gary as well saying, yep, 100% there. But of course, that is up against, he is of the same generation of Oscar Piastri, who has set that benchmark. So it would mean Oscar would have to fall away a little bit. And at the moment, he seems like he is only on one trajectory after his third race win. Was it for Oscar this weekend, I believe?
Yes, third race win, yeah.
Third race win. We'll see, though. We'll keep tabs on that. So that shout you've made there that he will outdo Oscar's rookie season, which was 89 points. So let's see what Kimi Antonelli does for 2025. Let's move it forwards then, Callum, and get into our drivers' champion for the last 4 seasons, Max Verstappen.
Yeah.
Who another solid performance, right? But we know that you could put Max in any car and he's going to represent on track. But what did you make of the weekend for Red Bull? And let's start with Max before we get into the whole Liam Lawson thing. What did you make of Max's performance?
I think Max got maximum points he could have got this weekend. That car isn't great. I think we've all seen it now. That car is potentially 4th fastest. The racing balls and at least qualifying isn't actually that far behind the Red Bull in terms of pace.
What did you make of Max's? What did you make of Max's interview, where when he was asked about how well the racing bulls were performing, he said, "Well, yeah, maybe that says something." What is that cryptic from Max?
I think it is a little bit. Horner came out and said that Max been a lot more involved in like the development side, the strategy side, helping with the car. So he must know something's wrong with that car. I think he pretty much already come out and said it pretty much. So I think it's definitely a little bit of cryptic from Max about the car. I've heard a little bit about him not being happy with Lawson being replaced for reasons, basically saying the car just isn't good enough. No one could really drive this car, basically. Obviously, if that's true or not, don't know. There's a lot of rumors in the F1 world, but it is interesting to see Max come out and say these comments about the car. It's bad for Max when he has to say basically the only way he can win if all the cars in front of him retire. Like, that's nothing usual from Max of what he would usually say coming into a Grand Prix weekend. So it's not looking good for Red Bull, I don't think.
Yeah, they're in a difficult position, aren't they? Because I guess if you push car development in such a bespoke direction for a particular driver, which it seems they have, you're going to have the problem that they've now got, which Sergio Perez talked about almost a year ago, just saying how difficult this car was to drive. And at the time, people behind the scenes weren't making much noise. But now it feels like they're saying, oh, look, we've been bitten in the backside here. What do they do moving forwards? I saw an article today and it referenced it as the curse of the honey badger, but I'm not sure it's anything to do with Daniel Ricciardo leaving. What do you think they do as they move forwards, the Red Bull team?
I think they've got to start developing both cars sort of more equally. I think no matter what you give Max, no matter what car you give him, he's going to be up there. So just make the car better for both drivers. At the end of the day, they need to do much better than what they are. I think, you can't tell me both Perez and Lawson are that bad of drivers. We saw Lawson in the Racing Bulls last year. He was
Yeah.
doing much better than what he currently is doing, and that Red Bull car is faster than what that Racing Bulls car was. So, there's talks of potentially Yuki coming in, but if we see the exact same results from Yuki, what do we do then?
Yeah, well, you've got to remember as well, before Sergio Perez, the issue Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon,
Yep.
this has been a long, long time now.
Long time.
Gary making the point that, are they avoiding Tsunoda because Max will be worried about him pushing him too hard? Do you think that is why Yuki's not got that opportunity yet?
I don't really know why Yuki hasn't got that opportunity yet. A lot of noise of when, Perez got dropped, even myself included, wanted Yuki to get that seat, but I wasn't, angry that Lawson got the seat, But I don't think Max is worried that Yuki will push him too much. We know Yuki's a little bit of a hothead at times. So maybe it's that thought of, Max can sometimes be a bit of a hothead. Yuki can be a bit of a hothead sometimes. So maybe they'll clash too much. But let's be honest, Max is like the number one driver in F1 right now. I don't think he's worried about anyone on the grid, no matter who his teammate is. So I don't think Tsunoda will push him too hard, but we'll just have to see with Yuki if he gets that Red Bull seat.
Yeah, it was another weekend to forget for Liam Lawson, wasn't it? Performance-wise, Martin Brundle, when I was watching the broadcast, just saying he's driving like someone who doesn't have belief in the car's performance. He just, he's just not attempting to throw it where he needs to throw it. I saw that they're seriously considering, again, this is all rumor mill and whispers, but they could seriously be considering swapping Yuki and Liam for Japan the next race. Could some of it be in favour for Liam Lawson, though, in a sense of, because if Yuki goes in and then he can't perform, then at least Liam Lawson can go, see? So I think it could be good management of Red Bull if they were to switch it about how they frame it to Liam Lawson almost. What do you think?
I definitely think that could be a way to look at it. If Yuki does perform with the car, that's a really bad look on Lawson. But even if the car isn't great, I don't see the point of swapping the drivers much. If that car isn't simply good enough, just develop it. And if they develop it and see good results in the development, but Lawson isn't still performing, then do the swap. I don't think there's much point of swapping drivers if the car just is simply just going to keep getting P15s, going out in Q1s, etc. So I think try and develop the car first. And then if Lawson still isn't up to scratch, then potentially look at changing the drivers. But with how that current car is looking, I don't think Yuki will do that much better with it.
Do you think anybody in the Red Bull setup is regretting not giving Liam Lawson more time during testing in the car? Because we know Max loves the last day, doesn't he? So the whole of day 3, Max always gets. And again, it's, okay, Max, we want to make you happy, but what will also make you happy is having a number 2 driver that's going to be in and around you to support you towards the front of the grid. Do you think there's some regrets there in the team that they perhaps didn't dig a little deeper with Liam?
I definitely think there's going to be some regrets not giving Lawson a bit more time with the Red Bull car. But it's quite interesting because I remember the Bahrain tests. Lawson was actually doing pretty solid. The car didn't look near as unstable to drive than it is now. So it's interesting how they've gone from the Bahrain tests to now, to the development now. Obviously, I know it's only testing, but the car wasn't near as shaky and as unstable as it was, back then. So it's interesting how they develop a car like that.
Parquet 713 there on the screen asking, the larger story here is about Red Bull's eating up these second drivers so frequently, which is very true. And I guess we have to remember there's a responsibility as well with these young men not to completely destroy their image and self-confidence. And we've seen some of them pick themselves up, a la Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon, even when it hasn't worked out. What's the purpose of racing bulls even if they're not creating drivers that can be sustained alongside Max? Or is Max the problem? That's not me saying he is, but I've just posed that to you, Callum.
I think Max has kind of created an issue with Red Bull because he's so good, because he's always in the drivers' championship fight, and because he likes his car very much sort of heavily understeer on the back sort of side of things. It's definitely created an element of the second driver's always going to struggle to adapt to how the Red Bull car is, unless they completely change how that car fundamentally works, which I don't know if possible with like obviously the tight budgets they've got. So I think Max, in a way, obviously he's phenomenal. You know, in 2023 he won the Constructors' Championship himself. So I'm not saying Max is an issue. He's been very much, you know, the reason why Red Bull has been so successful the last few years. But you know, if Max decides to just simply retire at the end of the season, they're going to be in a real struggle with how that car performs, because I don't think anyone can drive with how Max has his car. So they definitely need to start looking at how they can potentially balance the car a bit more to suit both drivers. If not, because Max in 26 could just go, you know what, moving to Mercedes or something along those lines for all we know. Could go to Aston Martin for all we know, or just simply retire due to him, you know, having his child. Obviously, I do think he'll stay Red Bull for a few more years. I don't think he'll just instantly drop them, but Max is there to win. He's there to win drivers' championships. And Helmut Marko even come out and said, if we can't deliver that car, then we don't know what we'll do with Max. He might just, you know, might just end up leaving for all we know.
I'm going to throw it almost to a football analogy. I know that many, many years ago, Arsene Wenger went into the academy at Arsenal and got all the kids' teams to play how the first team played. And I know Pep Guardiola's done the same at Manchester City. Maybe Red Bull need to start their driver academy saying, right, all of you guys, you're going to drive this setup with the car very much on the nose. It's going to be shaky, shaky, shaky. But if we give you 10 years in this cart like that, you'll figure it out, and then they'll have a second driver.
It's definitely, you know, they definitely need to sort out the second driver problem. You know, you can't tell me that Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon, who we've both seen have been very good drivers since leaving Red Bull. You know, the same goes for Sergio Perez, who started his Red Bull career really good and slowly, unfortunately, went on a bit of a downward spiral. And you can't tell me that also Liam Lawson is a really bad driver. You know, you can't tell me all four of these drivers who have shown their talents in the past suddenly just cannot perform whatsoever. I know there's going to be a bit of pressure, obviously being against Max Verstappen, someone with his caliber, but they've definitely got an issue with that second Red Bull seat, whether it's some sort of curse, as everyone keeps calling it, the honey badger curse, or it honestly does feel like a curse at times, with how bad everyone supposedly performs in that second Red Bull seat. It kind of is just mind-boggling at times, to be honest.
Let's move it forwards and turn our attention to the smallest team on the grid with regards to investment and infrastructure, Haas, who, I mean, a dream Grand Prix for them with a double points finish for Esteban Ocon and Oliver Bearman after the disqualifications that happened. But yeah, P5 and P8 for Haas. What a performance. And I know you want to talk about your Williams in a little while as well, but done really, really well. And quietly going about their business during the race, even though they didn't qualify that strongly.
It's a complete opposite to how they performed last weekend. They were by far the slowest car on the grids. Bearman was crashing out every single lap, having gearbox issues in qualifying, and even when there was 6 DNFs, they were still 13th and 14th, which were dead last technically with all the DNFs, but completely changed this weekend. You know, some of the moves they were making. My favorite part of the weekend was Bearman just saying ciao to Lawson on the radio. That was probably one of my favorite moments. Ocon's move against Antonelli when he went onto the grass was simply phenomenal. They're both very...
On your opinion, how did Antonelli not get investigated for that? Because there was not... I know you're allowed to move with the move, but you're not allowed to move twice, right? But he's not left the car space. He's squeezed him off the track.
Yeah, but we know what the FAA like. Consistently inconsistent, I would say, is the best way to describe the FIA. So when I did watch, I was like, Ocon has kind of been pushed off here, but he done absolutely phenomenal to keep it up, keep it straight, keep it going, and eventually make a really nice, solid move on Anthony.
And that's another great example as well of how engineering knowledge can come into play and the alternate strategy that they went for with Oliver Bearman. Looking at no one used a hard tyre at all, did they, in any of the FP sessions? And we knew it was going to be critical during the race, but no one wanted to give away any performance on the compound. But Haas are a team that made it work. What did you think at the beginning of the race? Because, I mean, they performed well. And also Lance Stroll performed well on this alternative strategy. Were you skeptical at the beginning of the race, Callum?
there's always going to be a little bit skeptical for me when obviously it's not necessarily proven, hasn't been used at all.
It's
Mercedes were a
brave,
team
isn't it? Very
it's
brave
very
from them.
brave. Mercedes were a team with George Russell. He struggled a little bit on the hard tyres. He lost a lot of time to McLaren until eventually Lando's brakes decided to have a little issue. But it worked beautifully for Haas. They've performed extremely well this weekend. They're now on 14 overall points. As painful as to say, only 3 behind Ferrari so far in just one Grand Prix weekend. But I said from the start of the season, I think Ocon and Behrman could be one of the most talented driver pairings on the grid. And after that race, it definitely seems like they could move forward. But I've always said to myself, I think it's going to be very much track to track this year in terms of performances for cars. Sauber looked all right last weekend and we're kind of in no man's land this weekend. Haas looked absolutely nowhere last weekend and then I found loads of pace this weekend. So I think this year's going to be very much strategy based, a lot more track to track based than it was in previous years.
How do you feel about Haas's future as well? With Parquet 713, just Haas with the American flag there. We're waiting with bated breath for this emerging market that is America, and it is slowly bubbling with all the Grand Prix that are happening stateside now, and you see the epic events that they are. That's only going to continue, isn't it? And do you almost feel like Haas are just waiting? They're biding their time. We've got this big Cadillac entry that's going to come in 2026. And what do you think the future of Haas could be off of the back of that?
I think Haas is going to have a more successful future than they have recently. There's a lot more American based. Obviously, Cadillac coming in is very big news. There's even talks of potentially a 12 team coming in eventually in a few years' time, possibly once the new regulations get updated once again. But I think Haas are going to have a more successful future. I mean, last year they completely turned it around. Hulkenberg was phenomenal all year. Kevin Magnussen was inconsistent, with his slight dive bombing attempts at times to defend Hulkenberg, but he was extremely useful when he needed to be. And I think that's going to continue this year. I think Haas, especially when they're on the hard tyres, look really good. And I think if they can get more investment in, more money, and I definitely think they can turn it around compared to where they were a few years ago when they had Mazepin and Schumacher in the lineups, constantly finishing 19th and 20th all the time.
Yeah, and the spotlight coming up next, of course, will be Japan, where they've got a Japanese team principal now. Because of that, there's involvement with Toyota, so they will be hoping to keep this positive momentum going into the next Grand Prix in a couple of weeks, because success breeds interest and investment in the world of Formula One, doesn't it? Rihanna just saying as well there, hoping for great things from Haas. And I'm very much a general F1 fan. I've got my favorites, but I want everybody to be successful. And I love the weekend like we've just had. So that topsy-turvy, the grid's mixed up between sprint and Grand Prix, or even if it's just a solo Grand Prix weekend, you want to tune in for the jeopardy that is anyone can win, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the exciting thing about F1. The sprint race compared to the actual race was completely different for certain teams. And it's always exciting, maybe it's not your favorite team, but if some reason, Bortoletto somehow got on the podium, I'll be absolutely astounded. I'll be celebrating. I'll be throwing it all over my social medias. You want all these people to do well, especially for me, the rookies. I always want the rookies to do well because they're under the most pressure. Because if they don't do well, as we've seen in the current world of Formula One, you're probably going to get kicked out. There's so much talent out there right now, such as Colapinto, who's just waiting to get his chance. You've got Felipe Drogovic, who's been waiting for his chance for God knows how long. There's a lot of emerging talent that isn't being used there. So I think with the introduction of Cadillac and potentially a 12 team in the future, that's going to help it a bit more, help the rookies not have as much pressure on them as they have the years before. Looking at people like, Logan Sargent, Nick de Vries, for instance.
No disrespect, Logan or Nick. But moving our attention to your team, you're sporting their colours here this evening, Callum. Williams, there was a man who we knew it was always going to be a good weekend for because it was his birthday, Alex Albon. But we never expected, well, I mean, I certainly didn't, that at one point he would be leading the race. And second points finish of the season from back-to-back Grand Prix. This step up in competition between him and his teammates seems to really be bringing out the best for Alex Albon. And maybe also, again, this little idea that a bit of pressure's off his shoulders because it's not just all on him now.
I definitely think so. I think, previous years he's had, no offense to them, Logan Sargent, Nicholas Latifi as his teammates, who weren't exactly the best drivers in the world. But Carlos Sainz is a Grand Prix winner. He's got multiple podiums. He was close to winning constructors last year with Ferrari. He's obviously come in. And a lot of people have put the expectations on Sainz to do really well. And I think that's allowed Albon just to sort of put all the pressure off his shoulders a bit, saying, I'm not the only one that has to carry this team race after race after race to get these points. Because, I know Sainz is struggling a bit right now, but no doubt he will be back sooner or later with some really good performances. So I think that's definitely helped Alex Albon push himself to do better, and because he knows that Carlos Sainz is an extremely talented driver and he needs to be able to keep up with Sainz at least.
He's got Gary's seal of approval. Albon, another good driver from him. So Gaz, very much a fan as well. Carlos Sainz getting his first points of the season. Just a buoyant performance from Williams. All will be well back at Grove in Oxfordshire. How do they continue this momentum, Callum, for you into Japan?
I think they just got to keep doing what they're doing. They've clearly had good development since last year. I already know Alex Albon's already got more points than he does all of last season. Last season he got, I think, 12 points, and this year he's already on 16 points. Williams last year got 17 total points. This year they're already on 17 points. I remember James Vowell in the interview said, 23, 24, 25 seasons don't matter. We're concentrated on 26. Something's clearly changed since that's been said, and obviously this season they've clearly got development right with whatever they've managed to do behind the scenes, and it's clearly worked. They're doing really well, currently ahead of Ferrari. Obviously that will probably eventually change, but they just got to keep doing what they're doing. The drivers just got to keep being consistent, getting into those good positions in qualifying. I think that's the most important thing for people like Alex Albon. They've got to do good in qualifying in order to stay out the rankings, because they're great drivers, but can they handle the pressure when they're qualifying back to in the Q1s, in the P15s, etc. again? We're yet to see, but they've got to continue with good development. I think that's the main thing for Williams. We've seen a few times in the past development not being great, and maybe they start the season well and then fell off drastically throughout the season. So I think that's the most important thing for James Vowell's men to get correct this year.
And women, of course.
Of course, women as well. Of course.
Yeah, so they're probably reaping the benefits as well from James Vowell's pushing them in last year's off-season, right? Now, initially, it was kind of, what's the opposite? It was 2 steps back, but now they could be looking at 3-4 steps forward, because although they didn't have spare parts and a spare chassis, now it feels like he's probably put in place a whole host of systems that means the team can be ready to push forwards.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Last season was definitely the greatest year for Williams. Not having spare parts, only running one car during the race, for instance, was pretty embarrassing, let's be honest, at the time for them. But it's definitely worked in their favour, at least coming into this season. Maybe they saved a lot of the budget from last year. Obviously, not having those spare parts, not having the biggest budget last season, obviously seems to have helped them this season with developing the car. So, yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Great strategy call as well for using the extra set of softs in Q2, right, to get into Q3.
Yeah.
And do you think that some of the midfield teams, because it's so competitive there now, do you think we could see that more just to seal P9, P10 in qualifying? All right, you've used the set that means you can't improve in Q3, but you're in the top 10 straight off.
Yeah, I definitely see more teams using that in the future. I think that's the most important part, because I think some tracks in the future, for instance, Monaco, for instance, you can't really overtake there. So it's tracks where you can't really overtake. Shanghai was kind of in the middle of you can overtake, but it's not the easiest to. Getting those good qualifying positions is more important than having a spare set of soft tyres. They know they're not going to get the P1s against people like Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, the Mercedes drivers, for instance. But just getting those P9 places where they can gain a couple of points, keep that position, I think is going to be more important coming into future races.
Yeah, just say to your driver, get out there and make that car as wide as possible. Let's move it forwards then and take a look at Aston Martin and their performance. You mentioned a little earlier in the show about Lance Stroll and there not being much expectation on him this season. but he's delivered so far.
Yeah.
Double points finishes in Grand Prix with the alternative strategy as well. So we have to give Lance and the Aston Martin team props for that. And probably somewhat surprised that in the other side of the garage, it's been a double DNF so far for Fernando Alonso. Would you echo that, Callum?
It's been mixed opinions with obviously Aston Martin this year. Obviously, I think a lot of their focus is going to be on the 26 design. Obviously, Nui fully focusing on the 2026 design. So I think a lot of the budget will be going into that. But I think they should be happy so far. You know, I think it's 10 points so far for them. Lance Stroll, you know, I know he's got all the points. I think people probably thought Fernando Alonso would get those points. It's been, you know, very unfortunate for him. But I'm sure Fernando Alonso will be back. He always manages to weave his way up there still, even when the car isn't great. So, but I have to give big props to Lance Stroll. I know not a lot of people will. But it's never a case of, you know, hating Lance Stroll or anything. It's just never been the greatest of drivers on the track, you know, making silly mistakes here and there, bumping into drivers when it hasn't needed to. But drove a great race in Australia, you know, kept it calm, kept out of the wall, unlike, you know, a lot of the drivers, and had a very solid race during the Chinese Grand Prix with a great strategy call from the Aston Martin crew.
And we know that officially, Adrian Newey didn't start until March of this year.
Yeah.
But what kind of impact do you still think he could have? You mentioned earlier with Mercedes about development. Development could be key at Aston Martin, couldn't it? They almost want to turn their season on their head to how they've been in the last couple, where they started well but fell away. What difference can Newey make across 2025, do you think?
We know Newey is one of the most fantastic engineers, car designers of all time. You know, he's turned teams upside down. You know, look what he's done to Red Bull, for instance, turned them from basically nothing into championship winners, both drivers and constructors, with his brilliant designs. Not saying it's all him, he's got help along the way, but he's definitely the brains behind the operation. And I think even if it's just a little bit of help here and there with the development of this season, I think they would rather start off worse and get better throughout the year than have the alternative of having 5 good races at the start of the year and then completely fall off. So I think Adrian Newey is definitely going to not just affect the development of car, but affect how the drivers perform. You know, having that big boost of mentality, I think, is going to come in from them of like, we're going to perform well this year. Next year is going to be an even bigger year for them. So I think it's going to help both Alonso with his mentality, because if Newey didn't come in, I don't know where Fernando Alonso mindset would have been like, oh, this car is kind of going in no direction. But now with Newey coming in, I think that's really going to push him to go for those wins, hopefully, next year.
We talked about drivers' mentality and maybe just as a collective as well, team mentality. So important. And you've got winners in there now. Adrian Newey, Dan Gurney went in there a couple of seasons before him from Red Bull. You've got Andy Cowell, who's now heading it up, who headed up Mercedes higher performance powertrains. And they're also taking the chassis guy from Ferrari, I believe, who's been told that he can't leave until he's on gardening leave, I think, till the end of this season. But as we know, Lawrence Stroll has got a limitless checkbook with regards to becoming a world champion. So it will continue at Aston Martin for the time being. But Racing Bulls, Callum.
Yes.
They're both qualified very well, but then brought home no points. And particularly Yuki Tsunoda, with the whispers that are happening, Yuki would have wanted a better performance across this weekend, although there was some seriously bad luck involved in his Grand Prix.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what happened, whether it was the dirty air or just something, but, you know, his front wing decided just to implode on itself during the Grand Prix. But I also think Racing Bull's strategies this year, their strategy calls have been atrocious for both drivers, especially for Yuki's case. Happened in Australia, they kept him out for way too long, where he should have secured, you know, at least a probably P6, P5, P7 sort of area and would have scored solid points. I think it was the same again this weekend. You know, going for the strategy that they went with probably wasn't the right call. Obviously, it wasn't the right call, but Yuki probably should have been getting double points in both Australia and in the Chinese Grand Prix, and should be much higher up than where he is now.
And his teammate Isaac Hadjar, of course, who outqualified Yuki this weekend, but only managed to finish P11 just outside of the points after the disqualifications. Not all within his hands because of strategy. There's potential in the young man, but we're going to come to that word consistency, aren't we? And I think
Yeah.
we see over years with the top guys, what stands them apart is that they're just almost in like autopilot mode of lap after lap after race after race. And that one moment of lacking concentration, like we saw from Adja in Australia, could be the end of your race. What are you making of Isaac Hadja, what you've seen of him so far? Because he was a very late call, wasn't he, to go in that seat?
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people fully expected him to get that seat. You know, he came runners-up last year in the F2 Championship against Gabriel Bortolotto, who's obviously in the Sauber seat right now. But at least in qualifying performances, you know, he's been the best of the rookies so far. He's outqualified people the likes of Kimi Antonelli in the Mercedes, which seems to be a better car than the Racing Bulls. And he's been phenomenal in qualifying, but then it comes to the race, and it's like you said, the consistency across multiple laps, a whole Grand Prix just doesn't seem to be there right now. But at the same time, it's only been 2 races for him in F1. I think give him longer, give him more time, which I think Racing Bulls will do, unless they decide to throw him instead of Yuki in the Red Bull seat, which, hey, you never know with Red Bull anymore. They might decide to chuck Hajar in there for unknown reasons. But I think give him time, and I think he'll definitely get more consistent, at least in the racing terms. But he's definitely got at least the 1 lap pace in him.
Yeah, F2, there was a real consistent moment in the season, but towards the end, he really didn't capitalize on a couple of
Yeah.
opportunities, did he? And he stalled it on the final
Yeah.
race, which came out of contention for the World Championship. And that must have been really gutting for him as a young man. But perhaps as well, these things happen and you learn your lesson from it,
Yeah.
and he grows as an individual. That's what we're hoping for. But also seems like a fun character to have in F1, which is important nowadays, isn't it?
Yeah, I definitely think having a character definitely helps you in F1. I'm not saying it's obviously you've got to be a good driver. That's first of all, you've got to be a talented driver to be able to drive the car. But he definitely has a good character about him. I think all the rookies do. They all seem. I remember that interview where they all 5 of them did an interview, and it was like the funniest thing I've watched in a
Around the
while.
table, yeah, I
Yeah,
saw
around
that.
the table, all having a laugh, joking around with each other, taking the mick out of each other. All the rookies seem to have a really good character about them, and that's what I like about all of them. But it might have been covered last weekend, but I think Helmut Marko's comments on a jar were simply unacceptable. You know, he's allowed to show his emotion the way he wants, you know, whether that's through crying or whether that's just being angry. It's how he wants to portray himself, and that's fine. Obviously, he was very disappointed with how his race went last weekend. It's probably going to be disappointed with how his race went this weekend. So just sort of let him show his emotions. I think Helmut Marko, it'll be better for him to just not talk, I think, some of the times.
Well, listen, we love sport because of how it evokes our emotions. And
Yeah.
one thing I will say in Helmut Marko's defense is it was translated, I believe, from
Oh,
German.
okay.
And having worked with Germans myself, sometimes in translation, they can seem
Yeah.
overly direct and a bit rude, but maybe
Yeah.
he didn't mean it with the same malice as which it was printed.
Yeah.
And I'm sure behind the scenes, he's put his arm around him and said, "I still love you, la petite Prost," as he called it. Let's take a look at Alpine then, Callum, and their performance across the weekend. Another difficult
Yeah.
one for them. Pierre Gasly amongst the drivers disqualified for being
Yeah.
underweight. So there's something that he hasn't got to look at. But for him, where the team is at, how do you feel that they're going to keep Gasly motivated? Because remember, that's the guy that they put all their eggs in his basket to an extent, but it feels like there's a lot of unsettled stuff going on around him in the team at the moment.
Alpine are definitely one of those teams that have been a bit of a mess the last few years, constantly being in the news for kind of the wrong reasons. And obviously they're the only team so far yet to score a single point this year, which, you know, I don't think anyone was expected coming into the season. Both Doohan and Gasly looked pretty solid during the Bahrain tests. So it's definitely disappointing to see. And Pierre Gasly, as we all know, is a very, very, very talented and good quality driver.
Race winner.
You know, race winner as well with an
Yeah.
AlphaTauri, which I don't think anyone expected. He's been on podiums with the Alpine team, even when they probably shouldn't have been those positions. But it's going to be hard for Alpine to keep him, especially with the way they're going right now. You know, Alpine's future, they might not even be called Alpine in the future. Apparently, you know, there's stuff behind the scenes with that sort of thing. They're going to change their engine entirely, which goes against what Alpine, you know, are truly about. So it's definitely interested to see where Alpine go in the future, whether that's with Pierre Gasly or not. I can't see it right now, personally.
And Jack Doohan in the second seat there. There's been a lot of pressure on him since the announcement. He would have liked to have done better in his home Grand Prix in Australia. And then this one in China, a 10-second penalty that he had to incur as well. What have you made of Doohan, what you've seen of him so far in his F1 career?
Doohan's one of the drivers that I really wanted to hit the ground running, really start off well. Obviously, there was talks of Colapinto already replacing him basically before the season's even begun, which is extreme pressure to have on a driver who's literally not even, well, has had one race at the end of last year, but basically hasn't driven in F1 before. But, this weekend wasn't great for him either. Obviously, crashed on the opening lap last weekend in his home Grand Prix, which wasn't great. And this weekend, had a 10-second time penalty in the sprint race. He spun in qualifying and then got another 10-second time penalty for, I think it was pushing off her jar in the race itself as well. So he's already picked up 4 penalty points this year, which I think, was it 12 or was it 13 for when you get
a ban?
Ban.
Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but it's early doors to be picking up some. He's giving Magnussen a run for his money.
Definitely. And I think FIA is clearly getting a bit stricter on these penalty points, these 10-second time penalties, and getting 4 in one weekend is definitely quite a lot. I really want Doohan, to do well. I really want him to succeed as a rookie, but like I just seen one of the comments say with Colapinto, who's already proved himself to be really good at the Williams team, round the corner, being the reserve driver.
Yeah, Rihanna there, just mentioning it.
Yeah, I just can't see Doohan, with how he's performing right now, lasting much longer with some very talented rookies or talented drivers behind him.
Yeah, as you mentioned, though, from a human perspective, we do wish him well, and hopefully he can turn it around because, we want to see everyone performing well in Formula One. Last team that we're going to discuss then, Sauber. So I'm going to start with Gabriel Bortoleto, in fact, and in the midfield there quite nicely. We saw some good battles with him and Isaac Hadjar during the race, which they would have been very familiar with from F2 last season. Maybe were you surprised that Bortoleto only got the squeeze at Sauber then as the champion?
It is a bit of a shame to come in with that sort of car. F2 champion, you would be hoping to get a better team than the team that finished with just 2 single points last season. A team that has struggled all season, but they're already doing better this year. Hulkenberg picked up 6 points, which is triple the amount of points they got last year. They seem to be doing all right in qualifying session. Bortoleto, I think, has got into 2 Q2 appearances now. With he's beaten Hulkenberg twice in qualifying. As we all know, Hulkenberg's a very good qualifier. We saw that at Haas last year, so that's definitely not an achievement to scoff at. But it is a bit of a shame to see him in that seat because I genuinely think he can do wonders. I saw him a lot in F2 last season and how he was driving. I remember seeing his P20 to P1 performance, which was simply phenomenal to see last season. And I do wish he was in a better car, but with Audi round the corner next year, maybe their car will improve. Maybe they'll get a better engine.
Has he got a multi-year contract? Is he assured?
I believe so. I believe so. I believe him and Hulkenberg both have a multi-year contract from memory, at least, anyway.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. We know Audi are going to invest heavily. We're already seeing, from a UK perspective, Audi branding now around our broadcast. We know that they've already announced there's going to be a UK not headquarters, but there's going to be a presence in the UK to attract the best talent in that region where they all sit engineer-wise. So it's going to be interesting, isn't it, to watch the Audi project? And I imagine there's already a lot going on behind the scenes there as well. But would you expect them to pick up points again across the season, or do you think it's going to be a real struggle for them for the duration?
I think a lot of the time they will struggle. I still feel like they're one of the cars at the back of the grid. But as we saw in Australia, when opportunity arises, I think the drivers like Hulkenberg, who has seen exceed the car expectations before, I think they will pick up more points across the season. I don't think it'll be many. I do expect them to still finish in the constructors in P10, but I think it'll be a more successful year than last year. And I do think with the current landscape of F1 and how, we saw Haas last race the slowest and this race one of the quicker cars, I definitely can see one track in the future of them just suddenly picking up like a P10 and P9, for instance.
We've only got to look at the upward spiral now that Williams find themselves on, and you could almost mirror it, can't you? Williams with the
Definitely.
Doralton American investment, and that's what can happen now at Sauber.
Yeah, definitely. Every team has a chance to develop a car in the correct direction, and I definitely think Sauber brought in, or Audi have brought in, a lot of good people for their team. So I definitely can see, whether that's with Sauber or with Audi, some good car developments, and they've got a talented group of drivers with Hulkenberg and Bortoletto. So I definitely think they can be a team that can do a lot better in the future.
Well, listen, Callum, it has been absolutely fantastic to chew the fat with you, my man, and what was
Brilliant.
a bumper experience of a Chinese Grand Prix weekend. I know we've run over by about 5 minutes or so, but that's testament to you, buddy. We're really enjoying the insights that you've given us, and
Brilliant.
also
Thanks so
the
much.
guys in the chat box as well. It's a pleasure for some of those that have returned. Thank you so much for the support, and for some of the newbies in there, including Rihanna Jordan. Hello, Rihanna. Thank you for sticking with us for the show. We very much appreciate you getting involved. Have you enjoyed yourself, Callum? And perhaps across the rest of the season, we might see you back at some point with that big Williams heart that you've got. Maybe it could be something like the British Grand Prix we could get you for.
Yeah, it's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for having me on. I love talking about F1 as much as possible. Obviously, not a lot of my friends, family are that into F1, so it's great that I can express that on here. So yeah, definitely, I'd definitely love to come on in the future.
Well, just like we're doing here, it's about the community that you can
Yeah.
find across the wonderful place that is the internet, my man, as well. For anybody out there that wants to follow you more and see the great content that you're making, where can they go?
They can go to Instagram and go to Grid Talk Global, and you will find me there. I'm on YouTube as Grid Talk Global as well. I'm starting to post long form videos. So if you're into the more long form videos, in-depth videos, I do some on YouTube as well.
Brilliant stuff, my man. We look forward to following that journey as
Brilliant.
well. And you guys out there, thank you so much for your time with us today, whether you're watching live or pre-recorded. Don't forget to spread the message, though, at Fans Forum across YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. We want to grow this community and get you guys very much involved in the conversation as well. We've got a little break now, haven't we? A couple of weeks off before everybody's eyes are focused on Japan, the 6th of April for the Grand Prix. And we'll be back with you here on Fans Forum on the 7th of April to conclude and review it all. So make sure that you join us once again. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you're watching from. Be good.